The airport gate was crowded, restless. Travelers shifted in their seats, tapping on phones, clutching coffee cups. At the far end, an old man sat quietly, his hands folded over a worn backpack, a faded veteran's cap pulled low over his brow. When the announcement came, "This seat is needed, sir. You'll have to stand," a few heads turned. The man hesitated, his knees stiff, his frame tired, but he rose without a word. A younger passenger smirked. "Come on, Grandpa," someone muttered. A couple of laughs rippled through the rows. The old man said nothing. He adjusted his cap, lowered his eyes, and stepped aside. He could have spoken, could have shown them who he was, but he didn't. The crowd saw only an aging traveler in a frayed jacket. What they didn't see was the history carried in his silence, the battles behind his limp, the memories stitched into that old cap. As he stood there, quiet, steady, the whispers grew bolder. Why doesn't he argue? Why doesn't he fight back? Because some men don't need to. And before the boarding doors closed that morning, the entire gate would learn exactly why.
Mornings for him were always quiet. He woke before the sun, the way he had for decades, though there was no commanding officer calling his name now. Just habit. Just discipline. His breakfast was the same every day. Black coffee, 1 egg, toast slightly burned on the edges. He sat at a small kitchen table with only one chair, the radio playing softly in the background. News, weather, static. He rarely changed the station. On the wall hung a single photograph, a group of young men in uniform, arms around each other, their smiles bright and careless. Most of them were gone now. He didn't need to count. He knew the names. He always knew the names. After breakfast, he'd take his slow walk to town. The limp was permanent, a souvenir from a night too many decades ago, on a stretch of ground halfway across the world. Every step now carried not just his weight, but the weight of memories. He wore the same cap every time he left the house. Faded green, the stitching frayed, the emblem almost rubbed out. To strangers, it was just an old piece of cloth. To him, it was a flag folded in silence. It was brothers buried, promises kept. At the diner, he'd sit at the corner booth, order the special, and eat in silence. The waitress knew him by his nod, more than his words. He never asked for much. Others hardly noticed. A tired man, walking slow. A man who blended into the background. They didn't see the soldier who had once run faster than bullets, who had carried men twice his size across mud and fire, who had written letters home he knew might never be read. The world moved on. New faces, new uniforms, new wars on the news. But for him, the old battles never ended. They lived in his limp, in the creases of his hands, in the silence of his meals. And still, he carried himself with the same quiet discipline he always had. No medals pinned to his chest, no stories offered to strangers. Just a cap. Just a man. Most passed by him without a glance. A few looked and dismissed him with a shrug. None stopped long enough to ask what the cap meant or what it had cost. And that's why, at the airport that morning, no one recognized him. Not yet.
The airport was loud that morning. Rolling suitcases hummed across the floor. Children tugged at their parents' hands. The gate agents called numbers that no one seemed to hear the first time. The old man stood quietly near the boarding line, his faded cap tilted forward, his ticket folded carefully in his hand. He'd arrived hours early. He always did. Discipline didn't leave a man, even after the war was long gone. When the agent's voice rose, it wasn't sharp, but it carried the practiced firmness of someone used to being obeyed. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside. This row is reserved." He looked down at the ticket in his hand, then back up. His lips parted slightly, as though he might say something, but Instead, he gave a small nod and shuffled to the side. A young man in a pressed shirt slipped into the space he left behind, glancing briefly at the cap before smirking to his companion. Guess he thought he belonged there. The other chuckled. A few passengers caught the exchange. No one spoke. A couple lowered their eyes to their phones, pretending they hadn't heard. Silence was easier. The old man didn't argue. He clutched his ticket a little tighter, adjusted the strap of his backpack, and stepped back against the wall. "Sir, you'll need to wait until the others are boarded," the agent added, without looking up. A ripple of impatience passed through the line. Some whispered, some sighed. A child giggled. The old man's face didn't change, but his eyes betrayed what his mouth refused to say. The sting wasn't in losing a seat. He had lost far greater things. The sting was in the way the world looked at him and saw nothing. He had once stood in front of men who saluted without hesitation, who followed his commands without question. Now he stood in front of strangers who couldn't even see him. The whispers grew louder. Why doesn't he just sit down somewhere else? Old folks think the world still owes them. Each word landed like a pebble against stone. They didn't break him. They couldn't. But they reminded him of the distance between who he once was and who the world now believed him to be. He breathed slowly, steadying himself the way he once steadied trembling hands under fire. No anger, no outburst, just silence. He thought of the men in that photograph on his wall, men who had laughed around campfires and cried into their helmets, men who had carried him when he couldn't walk, and whom he had carried when they could no longer stand. They weren't here to defend him now. The line moved forward. The old man waited. Someone muttered, "Why doesn't he just go home?" Someone else laughed. Still, he said nothing. His hand brushed the brim of his cap, a simple gesture. But inside, it was more than cloth he touched. It was the memory of the flag draped over too many caskets, the final salute given in silence, the weight of promises made on battlefields most had never heard of. His lips pressed together, thin and firm. His shoulders remained square. The crowd looked on. The crowd stayed quiet. Their silence was not ignorance. It was choice, the easy choice to watch and do nothing. And the old man, with his ticket in hand, stood alone in the middle of it.
For a long moment, he stood still, ticket in hand, shoulders square, eyes lowered. The voices around him blended into the blur of the airport. Snickers, whispers, the shifting sound of impatience. He could have spoken. He could have raised his voice, unfolded the years hidden inside that cap, told them about the days when silence meant survival, when his brothers leaned on him, when his body bore wounds for a flag they now walked past without a glance. But he didn't. Instead, he let the noise wash over him like rain. He had walked through worse storms. With a steady breath, he reached up and adjusted the brim of his cap. His fingers lingered there for just a second, pressing gently against the worn fabric, as though grounding himself in the memory it carried. Then, slowly, he straightened. The limp in his leg made every step uneven, but his posture was unyielding. He walked with the same deliberate rhythm that once carried him through smoke and fire, through mud and pain. A woman shifted in her chair, glancing up for only a moment before looking away. A young man in line opened his mouth as if to say something, then stopped. No one moved. The old man walked past them all, the smirking passengers, the impatient travelers, the indifferent crowd. He walked past without a word, without a plea, without explanation. And that was the hardest part, because as he moved, the quiet dignity in his steps made the air feel heavy. Those who watched felt it, even if they didn't understand. His silence wasn't weakness, it was strength. Every instinct in the heart of an onlooker wanted to cry out, "Tell them, show them, make them see who you are." But he refused. This was who he had always been. He had never fought for recognition. He had fought for the man beside him, for the home he loved, for the flag stitched to his sleeve, and those reasons did not require applause. The murmur of laughter followed him only a few steps before it faded into a guilty hush. The sight of his slow, deliberate walk, the limp, the squared shoulders, the cap, made it difficult to laugh for long. He walked toward the windows that looked out on the runway, with a morning light streamed through. For a second, his figure was framed in the glow, a silhouette of someone who carried far more than the crowd could ever guess. He didn't need to explain. He didn't need to remind them. His dignity spoke louder than any words. And so he kept walking, each step steady, each breath measured. He had been overlooked before, he had been forgotten before. And yet, he walked. Always, he walked.
The old man had nearly reached the edge of the boarding area when the sound of polished shoes struck the floor behind him. Sharp, steady, commanding. A figure in uniform had entered the gate. Not just any uniform, the kind that carried stars on the shoulders, ribbons on the chest, authority in every stitch. Conversations hushed as heads turned. A general was a rare sight in an airport. The officer's gaze scanned the room, indifferent at first, until it landed on the old man in the faded cap. And then he stopped. For a heartbeat, the crowd saw something shift in the general's face. Recognition, memory, a sudden weight that froze him in place. He stepped forward, not hurried, not casual. Every movement was deliberate, precise, the kind of march drilled into him decades ago. His eyes never left the old man. People began to murmur. The passengers who had laughed fell quiet, uncertain. The gate agent paused mid-sentence. Even the children stilled, sensing something important in the air. The old man turned, surprised by the silence behind him. His eyes lifted slowly and met the general's. And in that instant, the years fell away. Two soldiers bound by a history no one else in the room could comprehend. Without hesitation, the general's arm rose, fingers to brow, a perfect, unwavering salute. The kind of salute reserved not for rank, but for reverence. The room froze. Every laugh died in an instant. Every whisper choked in the throat. The old man didn't move at first. His lips pressed tightly, his chest rising with a breath that trembled just enough to reveal the truth he'd kept hidden. He did not return the salute. He didn't need to. The general held it long, steady, unflinching, until every soul in that gate understood. This was no tired traveler, no man to be pushed aside, no grandpa to laugh at. This was a soldier, a hero, a man who had carried more than any of them would ever know. The silence that followed was unlike any other. Heavy, respectful, a silence that acknowledged what words could not. Some lowered their eyes in shame. Others blinked back tears, suddenly aware of the cap, the limp, the posture that should have told them everything. But it was too late. They hadn't seen until someone greater had forced their eyes open. And still, the old man said nothing. The general lowered his hand at last, giving a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind of nod that said, "Thank you, brother." And with that, the truth of the man in the cap was finally known.
The gate was silent. Not the restless silence of a crowd waiting for boarding. Not the impatient quiet of people checking the time. This was different. Heavy, uneasy, reverent. The general's salute still lingered in the air, even after his hand had lowered. Every eye in the room stayed fixed on the old man with the faded cap. A woman near the front pressed her hand to her mouth. Another passenger whispered, barely audible, Who is he?" But the old man gave no answer. He didn't correct them. He didn't claim his past. He simply gave the smallest of nods. Acknowledgement, not boast. Gratitude, not pride. Then, without hurry, he turned back toward the boarding lane. His limp carried him slowly forward, each step steady, unbroken. The straps of his backpack dug into his shoulders, but he didn't seem to notice. He never had. The passengers who had mocked him couldn't raise their heads. The young man in the pressed shirt shifted uncomfortably in his seat, staring at the floor as if it might swallow him whole. The laughter that had come so easily moments ago now tasted bitter, stuck in their throats. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. And yet, without a single word from him, every person in that room understood. Respect does not come from announcements or uniforms alone. It comes from sacrifice, from years carried in silence, from the battles no one else had to fight because men like him already had. He did not pause to bask in the silence. He did not wait for recognition. He had lived too long to expect it. As he passed the boarding gate, the agent who had told him to step aside shifted awkwardly, her eyes downcast. For the first time that morning, she had no words. The old man walked on, quiet, steady, unshaken. He didn't need to prove anything. He never had. By the time he disappeared down the jet bridge, the room still hadn't found its voice. The echo of that salute, of that simple nod, stayed behind, heavier than applause, sharper than shame. Some men live loudly, others live quietly, but the ones who walked alone, who carried the weight for everyone else, leave a silence that speaks louder than words ever could. And on that morning, in that crowded airport gate, silence was the only thing left. Some men don't need introductions. They don't announce their service or wear their medals on their sleeve. They carry their rank in silence, in the way they walk, in the way they endure, in the weight of memories that never leave them. Their respect was earned long before today, long before airports and crowds. It was forged in mud, in fire, in sacrifice that most will never see. To laugh at them is ignorance. To dismiss them is blindness. But to recognize them, to stand, to honor, to salute them is justice. So the next time you see an old soldier walking quietly, wearing a faded cap that time has almost erased, remember this: salute the ones who walked alone, so we wouldn't have to.